record our class tonight, and I'll send out the link like I did last week. Okay, recording should be started. So welcome back to week 2 of starting and running a successful website. What we'll be doing this evening, I've got a little bit of time here at the beginning set aside for us to review what we covered last week, answer any questions that you guys might have about the homework or any of the topics in the course manual or that we talked about during class last week. And then we're going to spend most of today's class covering the assessment stage, which is the very beginning, sort of the initial things that you would do in a website project. Some people might even consider this before the project begins, because you're actually often doing most of the assessment stage before the project has been well defined, before a contract has been drawn up, things like that. But these are every bit as important to do as the things that come later in the project. So that's going to be our focus. The learning objectives that we're going to try to cover today will be to look at a client questionnaire, and I've got a sample one that's in the course manual, and we'll take a look at that, which will then lead to the creation of what you might call a site specification. Not every organization calls it this, but that's the term that I've used, which is just a place for documenting decisions that are made about the website project. We're also going to talk a bit about the target audiences for the website and how to go about defining those and documenting that. And we're going to go through a little exercise, introduce you to a process for kind of studying the strengths and weaknesses of comparable websites that are kind of like the one that you might be about to start building, so that you can learn from those about things that you want to do and perhaps also things that you don't want to do and want to avoid in the website you're about to build. So those will be our focuses, and as you can see, as we wrap up class, I'll talk a little bit about the assignments for week 2, which are up here. And then this stage, the assessment stage, will lead us well into next week, where we're going to talk about the analysis and planning stage, which is really where the formal project management, as formal as it needs to be for the scope of the project you're working on, but where most of that comes into play and where you start to really define some of the what the scope of the site is going to be, who's going to be involved, and so forth. So to get us started, I thought I would just open it up and ask you guys what questions you have from last week's class or from the assignments that you completed between last week and now.
John, question for you. Can you take the little simple 3-question test twice? I actually didn't realize it was open book, so I went through it and didn't quite get the highest score I wanted.
You only get to take it once, but don't worry. This is for those. The quizzes are really there to primarily help you prepare for the final quiz or exam that you will take at the end of the class, and that's the one that that we need to make sure that you pass in order to progress in your certificate.
Great. Now, is that an open book also?
It is. It is open book as
great.
well.
Great.
There's a lot of analysis questions in it where you really have to apply the knowledge, but it is definitely open book.
Great.
Mm-hmm. Other questions about last week? I'll just remind you of some of the things we talked about. So we spent a lot of time talking about the 6-stage process that we're going to be using in this certificate program. And we talked a little bit about how different organizations might talk about having different numbers of stages or group things a little bit differently. But that the process that you'll be learning here, starting with this assessment stage that we're going to focus on this evening, is really a fairly standardized process. With certainly there's some deviation from it, but it's a pretty consistent process you'll see most organizations following. We also talked a bit about the pricing, sort of cost models for websites and what typical hourly rates are for web professionals. He said, because I will occasionally have projects that I subcontract or subcontract parts of out, and I see hourly rates ranging anywhere from on the low end, $30, $40 an hour to at the higher end, maybe 100. Well, I wouldn't even say higher end. I'm sure there's no top to this, but what I consider a fairly expensive contractor would be anybody charging up above $100 an hour. And I would say most people are somewhere around the $50, $75 an hour range is a pretty reasonable place for someone that doesn't have 8 or 10 years of experience in the area. That's a pretty reasonable hourly rate. We talked a little bit about contracts and what some of the important elements are that should be captured in an agreement between a website designer and a client, and that even if that client is your own company, you may want to go through some of this and just be clear about what the deliverables are, when they're expected to be completed by. So the contract may not include financials of cost if you're talking about your own organization, but it's still useful to capture most of what would go into a formal contract, just so that everyone's on the same page and just sets up a good start to the project. And we talked just a little bit about copyright law and kind of how that plays into contracts between web designers and their clients, and how, in the U.S. at least, copyright law basically says that whoever creates a particular thing owns the copyright on that unless there's a document that says otherwise. So if you are designing a website for your client, essentially you own the design of that unless there's a contract that says that they own the design at the conclusion. And typically the way that I wrote my contracts to protect myself and the client, I should say the way I have always written my contracts, is that the client gains ownership of all of the material around the project when they finish paying me what they owe me. So that's my protection, is that when the final payment is made and there's nothing left to do, the client then assumes all copyright ownership for things in the project. But then I also do retain, with a little clause in the contract, the right to reuse portions of the project in future projects. That way, if I've created a really neat navigation bar or written some JavaScript code or cascading style sheet code that I don't want to have to recreate from scratch, I can then take pieces of that and reuse it, as long as the finished product doesn't in any way resemble the client's site. Most clients are perfectly fine with that.
John, I've got a question. There were a lot of tools that were mentioned in some of the extra reading that, I guess, are we going to learn about all these additional tools and capabilities that kind of the tricks of the trade and what tools to use?
Some of them, certainly. What do you remember any of them in particular?
Oh, and tools to like wireframe and tools to like, I don't know, maybe name websites, or, I don't know, content management tools. I mean, there seemed to be a lot of, if you look at the first article that you had there.
About launching the new website.
Launching the new. You could just seem to be able to drill down on a ton of material about how they did that and what tools they used.
Yeah, we will be talking about quite a few of those tools. Not necessarily everything, and I mean, I even today I keep encountering new tools that I've never used before, that I have to decide whether it's worth learning and trying to integrate that into my processes. But we will cover a lot of what they talked about in there, especially conceptual kind of things that they're talking about. So content management systems,
Yes.
we will talk about in here. Certainly, platforms. We'll talk a little bit about, Balsamiq is a great wireframe tool. We'll talk a little bit about wireframes in the design stage. And a few of these other, there's Trello is a great task for feedback management. So not all of these. There's Basecamp, which is a project management tool, but many of these things, or at least alternatives to these things, we will touch on. But that was one of the reasons that I wanted to kind of expose you to that article, because they've got their process and the things that they go through and the tools that they use. But really, the choice of those tools is very much tied to kind of how you decide you're going to work within the process yourself. For instance, we just finished looking at new project management tools, and we looked at Basecamp, which they mentioned, and found that it was far too simple for what we wanted. And so we looked at 3 other tools and tried to decide between those just by doing some Google searches and reading articles and such. But yeah, I think what you'll find as you go through this program and start to work in the areas that there are a huge number of those types of resources out there that can simplify your work greatly, and that you have to kind of sift through them to find which of them is most helpful for you. But,
thank you.
Sure.
Are those tools mainly pay per use, or is there like a membership that you would pay for the ability to use those?
There is every kind of cost model that you can imagine. Most of the online project management tools that are out there are a subscription model, where you would pay a monthly fee to have access to that project management component. But many of the other tools, well, I'll show you one that we just used, that I probably shouldn't show you, because you could use this to cheat on your capstone project. But this is a fantastic little company. Here's what they do. This company, and this is a pay per use, so there's no subscription or anything like that. It costs, say, $160 to $200, somewhere in that range. And basically what you do is you take a Photoshop design. So you design out what you want your website or your web page to look like. You do that in Photoshop, and then you basically upload that Photoshop design to this company, and they then turn that into a fully functional HTML page with cascading style sheets written behind the scenes, and professional quality work, for essentially a couple of $100. And when I look at that, I think, well, that's probably, at least 5-6 hours worth of work for me, knowing what I'm doing to do that. It's much more cost-effective if I've got other things that I could be doing for me to pay $200 to them, rather than having me or one of my teams spend 5, 6, 7 hours trying to get to the same place. And so this is
one of the tricks of the trade, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and it's a recent one. I actually got this one, was recommended by a subcontractor that we used to do design work, and we said, when you code this, because we knew she wasn't a coder, when you do work for clients, how do you get that done? And she said, oh, I just send it to these people, and they put it together and send it back. So, what we're finding nowadays is that projects in the web industry, it's really common that various pieces of those projects, and you guys may find this as you start to go out on your own, especially if you're freelancing, that you'll have a little network of connections. This person's really good at design, and this person over here really knows how to do search engine optimization better than I do, and this person over here might be great at more of the database kind of back-end coding kind of stuff. And then as your projects come up, you might be the primary lead on that project, but you might pull other people in, to depending on the scope of it and what your skill sets are. So that's just a good example of one of those services that's not a subscription. It's a pay only when you need it, but that I was very pleased. We used it for the first time just this week.
And it worked out great?
It worked out really well. Yeah,
Wow.
I was very pleased with the end product that I got back from them. And I don't know if they're based in, a lot of those programmers are in Eastern Europe or in India or various places, but we found that it was professionally run and was a very good value. So anyway, so yeah, but the two common models that you'll see are either a subscription model for these kind of services or a pay-per-use, and that's similarly with like the stock imagery. So with iStock Photo, you basically buy a number of credits, and then you use those each time you need to purchase an image from them. But there are some other companies that have a subscription model where you pay a monthly fee and you're allowed to download X number of images per month because of that subscription. Other questions? Okay. I noticed that some people, just so that everyone knows, the assignments that you have here, this one was to take a look at other website processes that other organizations might use, and you, my hope is that you will come up and actually add a discussion topic and enter some commentary for your assignments each week into SMU Learn. I mentioned these are not graded. You're all adults paying for the program, but as part of your learning process, going through this and completing these exercises in this course is helpful. And I will go and read it, and thought I would comment on a few of the ones that people who did their assignments.
So John, do you want
here.
feedback on every assignment added, or is that just on certain assignments that we can put feedback in?
Well, you'll have one assignment each week. So this week it was to review other website processes. This upcoming week it will be to complete a comparable website review, which we'll do an example of here in class. So for this upcoming week, between now and next week, you would click on this link, click Add a New Discussion Topic, and then you can add in your commentary here. And then others from the class can come and read it. So what I thought was interesting in the four website process reviews that were submitted up here, is how similar it was. It was interesting. I think the Renz from the University of Texas was pretty darn thorough. So obviously they've got a pretty well-defined process that they use. But if you look at the various items in this process, you will see a lot of similarities between what we're doing and what they do. What do they have? I guess 5 steps, and then the 6th and final step was to launch the website and implement a maintenance plan. So in effect, they're at about the same number of steps as what we're presenting in this program, starting with things like personas, which is essentially a way of identifying your target audience, holding a client interview, which we're going to talk about, the client questionnaire interview process, technological specifications. We're going to talk about a site specification document today. Project timeline will be what we cover next week. So I'm seeing all of these similarities between their process and what we're using. I also thought it was interesting what Sean posted about the 8-stage process that this organization uses, that essentially they had basically split some of our stages into 2 different stages and tackled them separately. So here they said, for example, or Sean said, the fourth step has a designer gather and create the site content, and then the fifth step is the functional programming with this code. So they're just breaking things up a little bit differently than what we're doing, but are still essentially progressing through the process in the same way. I'm trying to remember this PowerShift. Yeah, the PowerShift process that Melanie looked at, what I did think was interesting is, to me, where they're starting, and you'll see some of the web design companies, especially ones that focus on the design part of the web design, that they've sort of jumped forward a couple of stages from where I would begin. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't do the parts that we're going to talk about this week and next week, assessment and analysis and planning, but it may just mean that they're not capturing all of that in this document, because to me, starting, when you start with wireframes and the graphical concepts, some people do that. I feel like that's putting the cart before the horse. I don't want to start thinking about what the website's going to look like until I have a really clear idea of what the scope of the site's going to be, what the budget for the site's going to be, who the audience is, and some other things. And they capture that here. So they're kind of doing those in a little bit of the reverse of the way that I would do them. But again, you sometimes see companies that are really focused on the design side of web design that do put the design, they start doing the design earlier than I typically would, where my focus tends to be more around the business results coming out of the website than the attractiveness. And I'm not making a value judgment about that, just that's where my skill set is and the way I tend to run the projects. So, but if you have a chance, those of you who did not post the process maybe that you looked at up here, you can still come back and do that and add your process up here. But at the very least, I would encourage you to take a look at some of the other processes that Nicole, Melanie, Sean, and Ren have published, because I think they're informative to see how other organizations do it. Okay. Great. So any other questions before we jump into our material for this week?
It's kind of the kickoff meeting article was kind of interesting.
Yeah, it was, wasn't it? This is the first time I've taught this course and had students take a look at that article. By the way, part of the reason that I've chosen some of the articles I've chosen is to introduce you guys to some website resources. This company, alistapart.com, has some of the most useful, in my opinion, articles out there for web designers. They categorize them. You can see this one is under project management and business. But Alistapart has just top-notch articles that are really great to read. And I picked this one because in my organization, we have formal kickoff meetings for just almost every significant project, and have found them really valuable to make sure that everyone's on the same team. It's one of those things that's not, it's not a technical need of the project, like nothing, there's not any real good deliverable that comes out of a kickoff meeting. But it's one of those kind of project management techniques that generate some energy around the project, make sure that everyone that's going to be involved in the project knows what's going on, and that no one's sort of caught or blindsided down the road when they're asked to contribute to the project. It's just it's a really important communication tool, in my opinion, to help ensure the success of the project down the road by building energy and getting everyone on the same page from the beginning.
You know, John, the most interesting thing to me was all the terminology about the pre-kickoff meeting and all the work you need to do before you have the kickoff meeting to make sure everybody's bought in and everybody understands what's going on. Yes,
isn't that interesting? I'm looking to see if I have if I can show you guys some of our because we will have project updates. I'm looking to see if I've got an example of a pre-kickoff meeting and a kickoff meeting meeting plan. I'm not seeing one, but if I come across it, I'm looking through my files, because we do that. We have an internal kickoff meeting, and then we'll have a kickoff meeting with the client. But by the time we're talking to the client, they're really a lot of the questions that you saw in that article there. We try to have as many questions answered as we can. I don't like to go into a kickoff meeting with unknowns about the project. So I like to have those pre-kickoff meetings to answer all the questions. And the kickoff meeting is really where you're just coming back and you're basically saying, this is what we understand. This is what we heard you say. Want to make sure this is right, and if so, this is going to be fun. This is going to be awesome. We're going to do a great job. It's a lot more of a cheerleading kind of thing if you've done that pre-work. The worst thing is to be in one of those meetings and to find out something that you had no idea about that really changes the scope or the focus of the project, because then everyone kind of feels embarrassed and looks embarrassed. It's a bad start.
So you really want to meet with everybody from the customer side before they come to the kickoff meeting, so you don't have any executives saying, well, what about this key feature that I've been screaming about?
Yeah, we at least meet with the executives. That's exactly right. We don't always meet with everybody that's going to be on the project or part of it, but we want the lead person on the client side to have already said yes about everything. And so part of the purpose of the kickoff meeting is for their staff to see them say, yes, this is an important project for me. I want us to really put our resources behind this and make this successful. And that's an important message sometimes for the people who are already overworked and are being asked to, write content or collect images or, be part of this, this website project that they may not understand why they're doing it or, what the value of it is to the organization. A big part of those kickoff meetings is for them to see the executives say, this is really important. I want you guys to get behind this. So there's a lot of strategy that goes into that of, who do you talk to ahead of time and what do you talk to them about, and, what discussions do you allow during the kickoff meeting versus having beforehand or afterward. Okay. Well, so on that note, let's go ahead and talk about this assessment stage, because essentially the client questionnaire in the start of the website project is really part of what we're talking about, because to me, the kickoff meeting can't happen in my understanding or kind of opinion until the project has been defined. If it's a client kind of situation where you have a client and you are going to be building a website for them, there needs to be an understanding of scope and what the deliverables are and what the timeline for the project is. A whole bunch of other things have to be defined. Once you get most of that stuff defined, you can sign a contract, and then you can have a kickoff meeting. And so it's kind of where it fits in the process to me, and that's where by the time you get to that kickoff meeting, you should already have a pretty good sense of answers to most of the questions around the project. So that really is just a formal sort of milestone in the project where you say, okay, we're now ready to officially begin working on this project, and we want to bring everyone together that's going to be part of it and talk about it a little bit. And that's all of that sort of leading up to that kickoff meeting, leading up to kickoff meeting. It's what I consider the assessment stage. Okay. Now I mentioned earlier that in this assessment stage, often you're doing a lot of this work. If you're a freelancer or you're a web design firm or employed at a web design firm or own one, you're doing a lot of this assessment stage pro bono, and this is why freelancers and web design firms charge a much higher hourly rate than an employee would earn. And it's because until we define the scope of the project and a lot of other things, we can't sign a contract, so I can't begin charging you for my time. Okay? And so the faster, the more efficient you are at getting through this assessment stage and getting answers to these questions so that you can get a contract signed and the client's ready to start paying you, the faster you can earn money. So it's important to do this well, the assessments, for two reasons. One, because you want it to be accurate because it's going to help the success of the project. But two, you want to be efficient at it because you ain't getting paid for sitting down and doing a client interview. And you want to get those answers and then move on as quickly as you can to a proposal and a contract and then paid work. Okay.
Hey, John, if you want to mute me, that'd be great, because my dog is acting up. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. Let's see. I'm not sure if I can without, because you called in through the phone, didn't you?
Yeah. That's.
I can't mute you until you enter your PIN. Let's see. That should send you the PIN.
Yeah, I've got the PIN. Where do I just put it in the message section?
I think you put it in on your phone. I think you key it on your phone.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. John, that didn't work. I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. It's not too bad. If it gets too bad, we'll figure something out. So in this assessment stage, so let's talk about some of the components of the assessment stage. So as you can see up here, oh, he is kind of loud there. Let's see.
Does your phone have a mute button?
That's a good question.
I think I just muted myself.
We still hear you now, but you can try that again. Oh, I can mute you now. All right, I'm going to mute you, John. There we go. He got your PIN entered, so great. So I've got our course manual up here to lesson 2, this assessment stage, and the first part of it is talking about this site specification. Okay. And so the client questionnaire that I'm going to show you is just an example of what you might use. I always customize this to my client based on the project that I'm about to start. There may be some questions that I need to ask on one project that I don't on another. But the end goal of this questionnaire is to start to define what's called a site specification. And site specifications have morphed quite a bit over the past 10 years. Used to be, for a small-scale project, you could have the whole site specification in just a Word document. And I'll talk more about what goes into it. But nowadays, you'll see oftentimes people using online project management tools to capture a lot of this information. You'll see people using tools like Salesforce, which is a CRM system, customer relationship management tool, but also has the capabilities of doing various kinds of managing of information and documents and project plans and storing files up there, kinds of stuff. So you'll see some pretty sophisticated implementations for what traditionally would have been called a site specification. I'm not even sure you can call it that when you're have it stored in a huge system like Salesforce. But let's go back to the basics and think about what it is we're trying to capture and what the client questionnaire, what the purpose of this client questionnaire is. So what I want to do is let's take just a minute and think about a website project. Think about yourself starting up maybe your first website with a client, or I know some of you have got a little bit of experience in the area already. But so think about just starting a project. You're coming in. Somebody's called you on the phone and said, hey, I think I might want to hire you to build a website for me for my organization, or rebuild the website, redesign the site for my organization. what are some of the questions that immediately come to your mind when, what are some of the just initial questions that pop into your head, not knowing anything more than that about the project? You guys can unmute yourself and just throw some thoughts out there. I'll unmute John in case he wants to.
Business goals, John.
Business goals. Why are we building the website? What's the business objective for this? Absolutely. What else?
Who's using it?
Yeah. So yeah, who's going to be coming in and using this website? What else? What else? Is there already a website in existence that we're upgrading, or is this a brand new site for a new organization? Might be one thing I would ask. What else?
Maybe how do the Google Analytics work on your current site, or how do they look? How do the stats look?
Yeah, that's a great one, John. That's one thing that I look a lot at before starting a new project that a lot of people don't. But like, I want to see how are people navigating the current site? Like, what menu bar items are they using most often and least often? Because that might affect how I design the navigation in the new design. Because if there's things that are kind of prominently placed on the site that nobody uses, maybe we kind of pack those away somewhere so they're not quite so prominent.
Can you show them what search engine priority they have now and say, hey, with your new design we can get you, X higher up on the search engines?
Yeah, you absolutely can. But that then does go back to the question around, well, who's your audience? Because one of the things that I want to know is, are you expecting to get a lot of traffic to your website from search engines? Because some organizations, I mean, everybody would love to have that, but if it's a mature organization, they should be able to tell you, yeah, that's not really how people find our website. Or, yes, absolutely, we are incredibly dependent upon that, which then, lets you know how much of a priority it is. Let's see, I'm thinking about some other things that I want to know. I want to know what resources the client has at their disposal for the project. Like, I want to know, do you have a set of images that you've collected over the years that we can use in this, or are we going to have to either take photos or use stock photography? I want to know, do you have someone in your company who's a good writer who can be responsible for writing the contents of these pages? Or is that going to be something that I need to figure out how to do? I want to know, am I going to be responsible for project managing the process? Am I playing, how extensive is my role in this project? Am I running the whole thing, or am I responsible for only parts of it? Like, I've got clients sometimes that will say, we want you to develop a template for us, but then once we have a template, we have people internally that know Dreamweaver well enough that they can actually put the pages of the website together. Sometimes that's not a good idea, but those are good things to start feeling out. It's like, is this a start-to-finish project that I'm delivering for you, a finished website with 50 pages in it and all of this, or is my role more limited?
So what you're trying to understand is what are their skill sets internal, and how can you be complementary to those skill sets?
Yeah, that's right. Because that stuff almost always comes out anyway later, as you start to get into it. Like when you hand them a proposal that maybe is, a $40,000 proposal because you're doing everything, then suddenly they're backpedaling and saying, oh, wait, what can we cut out of this? So it's just good to know up front what resources they have and that they can bring to bear so that you can start to think within that. And if they tell you they've got a $30,000 budget, but you also know that they have internal resources to do some of this work, that lets you be more creative in some of the solutions you suggest, because now well, if they're going to do this and this and this, I can use my time to do some of these more interesting things that might be a value add that I otherwise wouldn't have the time to do within the budget they had if they weren't able to take on a few of the roles. Okay.
Where do you define all the links that they want to have?
Well, that's going to come links, inside the site or links outside the site.
Well, links inside the site to external resources, I guess.
That'll come much later. That'll come really as you're doing your navigational sitemap within the website and content. But it's okay to start asking about that. And I like to ask, is there like a big repository of information you want to put online, or let's think. So let's take a look at this sample client questionnaire. You should be able to see this on my screen. And what you'll see here is, again, this is just a sample. This is as if we were the whole pie organization. Remember the pie company that has retail stores and wholesale stores. And these are just hypothetical answers that they might provide to some of the questions that you might ask. Like, hey, do you already have a domain name for the website? Like, that's a good thing to know. Are you going to be responsible for finding one of those for them or not? I always ask a whole set of questions about what their company does. Like because I've come into companies before that are just things I have no clue about. Or I might know a little bit about the industry, but I don't know how they fit into that industry. My favorite example was a website I did called crushedcore.com. I'm sure it's not up anymore. I haven't looked at this in probably 10 years. It's not the website I did, but it's still the same company. So essentially what this company does is they take giant rolls of paper that get smushed as they're being shipped around the country, and they have hydraulic inflatable kind of presses that unsmush the rolls of paper, as you can see in that little graphic right there. In fact, I did something almost exactly like that in the website I built 10 years ago for them. Maybe 12 years ago for them. I didn't know anything about this company or how they work or what they did, so I had to ask a whole lot of questions like, who are your clients? Like, who is shipping these giant rolls of paper around the country on trains that get smushed and need to have them unsmushed? Because I needed to understand aspects of that before we could figure out, like, what do we promote on the website? And it's no accident that they've got an animated sort of visual of this happening on their homepage, because for their audience, that roll of paper might cost $5,000 or $10,000 for all of the paper and such that's on there. And sometimes it'll be aluminum foil kind of on those rolls or something else. And so for those companies, having one of those that gets crushed or smushed and having it fixed is worth a lot of money. So so I want to know all about that sort of stuff, how they're promoting their business, and then as you can see here, what's the mission of the website? So what's the goal of the site? And I give them some suggestions. Here's some questions about the audience that are coming. How do you measure success? Like, that's a great question I always like to put out there. Sometimes they don't know. I like to say, a year from now, what metrics would you look at and be able to say, wow, this was a really successful project to redesign this website? Is it the number of visitors you're getting to the site? Is it the number of leads that you're getting? Is it the number of e-commerce sales that are taking place? What is it? And that gives me an idea of kind of what motivates them. Okay. I asked some questions about the schedule for development of the site. I had a person tell me one time that they needed their website built in, it was like in 7 weeks. And I was like, wow, that's a really specific number. Like, they told me a day that they needed it done by. So, as I started prying into it and asking, what eventually came out was that they had, there was a major trade show, like in their industry. It was like the big international trade show of the year was on this specific date, and they had already had business cards printed up with their website on the business card, and they were going to this trade show, so they were like, I have to have a website by the time I go to this because I'm going to tell everyone that I have one when I hand them the card. So it's just good to know the schedule, the budget for the site, how people are going to find the site. That's where you can find out a little bit about whether they're going to do search engine optimization or not. And then a whole set of questions about content. Now, these are not designed to get at every nuance of the site. So if you look through some of these questions, and I encourage you to do this as you read this chapter this week, these are simply, this is the way I think of this, is this is a conversation starter. I don't send a questionnaire like this to a client and have them fill it out and send it back, because it's actually, for me, it's as important to hear their answers in conversation and to be able to ask follow-up questions to them as it is to get the specific answers to these questions, Because, if I say how many pages will the website contain, and they say, well, I think about 20, and I'd like to say, okay, what makes you say that? Are they just picking a number off the top of their head, or have they actually thought about this? And that'll give me a sense as to whether that's a pretty good estimate or whether we really don't know at this point. So sometimes those follow-up questions help you to understand how confident people are in their answers and how many more sort of deeper prying questions you're going to need to ask, either in this conversation or in future ones, before you can get answers to some of these. Here's another section that I often like to ask about up front. Once the website is built, because sometimes people haven't thought about this, who's going to update it? Who's going to manage the website? Because websites should not just sit out there for months and months without having any updates or changes, especially if there's going to be date-sensitive information in there. So I always like to talk a little bit about who's going to be doing the updates to the site, and that's a potential opportunity to kind of upsell if you're a freelancer or a web design firm, because it may be that they go, wow, I hadn't even thought about that. Is that something you guys can do for us when we need updates? So you're able to kind of talk about that early on so it doesn't become a surprise at the end, and they can already kind of be used to the idea that after the site is built, you're going to still be engaged with their organization. And then I always like to ask them to do this research. Sometimes I'll give them homework, and it's fun to kind of tell people that, when you're in an initial meeting, say, here's your homework. I want you to kind of, and this will be useful for you, between now and the next time that we meet about this, go and take a look at some of your competitors out there or companies that are similar to yours and see what you like. Find some that you like the look of. Find some you like the way they navigate, the way you kind of get to information on the site, these different categories. And then we talk next. What this does is it helps to make your client a more informed client. Because if they go and do this research and come back and say, I really like the look of this because of this reason, well, I think this competitor site does a really good job of showing this about their product. That's really helpful for you as a web designer, and it sort of gets their head thinking about their website a little differently than if they're just imagining it hypothetically. So, questions about that?
It's kind of a discovery process, which is interesting.
It very much is. It's very much a, and sometimes this questionnaire will lead to 10 or 20 other questions that I'll want to come back. And sometimes the person to answer some of these questions isn't even in the room during the first conversation. And you need to figure out who's the person who can help me understand, where the website's going to be hosted, or, some of these other aspects of it. So, again, the more efficient you are at this process, the faster you can get to a point where you're charging for the work if you're doing this for pay. Because I've seen this process early in my career. this process would sometimes go on for weeks. The discovery process, that's a good name for it, discovery, would sometimes just drag on and on and on because I didn't know how to get the answers that I needed quickly. And sometimes I would lose projects to other organizations who were better at this than I was because they could, because I was saying, oh, I need to have one more meeting with you to ask a few more questions. Meanwhile, this other group has already given them a proposal and said, we can get started tomorrow. So this is really important because not doing this, the risk, if you cut corners in this and don't really explore these areas, is that you get into the project, you put together a proposal, you estimate what the time it's going to take to do this is and the cost, and then you get a quarter of the way into it and you realize that there are all of these things you hadn't anticipated, or the client keeps coming up with things and saying, oh, we never talked about this, but blah, 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 and suddenly you have to start adjusting and start saying, oh, wow, that's going to take several hours more than I had originally expected. Do I just eat that, or do I talk to the client about charging them extra? And all of those are uncomfortable things. So doing this well up front is worth every minute that you can spend as long as you're doing it efficiently. Now, the outcome of that, so as you ask these questions and start to find out the answers, start to frame your understanding of the project, the site specification is a mechanism for documenting all of that. Okay, so a site specification is essentially a living document. And what does that mean?
You continue to work on it.
Yeah, that it's never really finished until the end of the project, and sometimes even after that. It's going to continue to evolve as you learn more about the project, but it's a place to document decisions. So if the client says, yes, we already have a domain name that we want to use with this website, it's X, crushedcore.com or whatever it might be, you're going to document that, and you want to keep a record of all of those decisions, and you want to make sure that that's being shared with the client, whether that's on some sort of a web location, like it could be in Google Docs, for example. You could store this. I've seen a lot of people use that. Or it could be an email, a Word document that you email to the client once a week or something like that. But you want to have a place where you're capturing all of these decisions. What colors are we going to use in this website? Approximately how many pages is the website going to contain? Who's responsible for selecting the images, the photos that are going to go onto the website? I mean, all of these questions that need answers, this is the document, or this is the place that you're going to store those answers. And I mentioned that 10, 15 years ago, the site specification could often be done in just a single Word document that might be a few pages long. Nowadays, depending on the complexity of the project, sometimes this is multiple documents, each of which can be fairly complex, especially if there are functional things that the website's going to do. Like if it's a site where people need to be able to log in and actually buy things or check their accounts or that sort of thing. This can be fairly sophisticated and can take a lot of documentation. Okay. So site specification is maybe a simplistic name for it. You'll hear some people call this a requirements document, and they'll talk about having functional requirements and stuff. This is the start of all of that, and it is a living document. I mean, there are going to be times when you ask the client, okay, do we have this pretty well, clear here, because I'm about to put together a proposal, but that doesn't mean it's not going to morph and adjust after that point. These kind of specifications never get locked down permanently, as much as we might like to think that we can do that. Any questions about that? Okay.
What do you limit the amount of time up front that you're not getting paid for? I mean, is there certain hours or certain weeks or days?
I try to limit the assessment stage this is maybe just a ballpark to no more than 10% of the overall project. That's a decent ballpark. 5%, if you can get it to 5%, that's good. So if I'm doing a 40-hour project, I think it's going to be like a 40-hour website project. If I'm spending more than about 4 hours figuring out what these details and interviewing the client and all of that, because you're not getting paid for that time. You don't get paid for the time you're putting together the proposal.
Right.
If you go beyond that, suddenly it's really hard to justify the time spent on it. But I will share with you guys a technique that I've used actually several times. I don't know who taught me this. I think it was a course I took, a continuing education course on consulting, starting a consulting business years ago, back in the 90s. And the gentleman said, in consulting, he's like, the only thing that you have to sell is your brain. So he's like, I will meet with the client for the first time. After that first meeting, if they want to talk to me further about their project, I'm going to bill them. And I thought, wow, well, I guess you can do that if you've got the nice gray hair there and can have that kind of authority. And I struggled with that as a young 20-something trying to kind of get my web business off the ground, but eventually discovered kind of a mechanism. What I would say to clients, if after that first interview I realized that this client really did not have a clue and it was going to take some time to figure out what they wanted and what they needed and all of that, I, on several occasions, would say to the client, it sounds like you still have quite a few questions about what's going to best serve you in this website. Why don't we do this? Why don't we write up a simple little contract, 1-page, 2-page contract that basically just hires me for 10 hours or 5 hours even. And then I will spend that time working with you and your organization to define exactly what you want in your project. It's basically putting together like a request for proposal, if you guys are familiar with something like that.
Yes.
I basically say, you're going to hire me to create an RFP that I will then bid on. But you can also take that RFP and you can have other website freelancers or companies bid on it as well. But then you'll know that you're getting apples to apples bids when you're getting those multiple bids, because you're asking everyone for kind of the same thing out of the project. And I can help you figure out what that is. Now, the advantage of that is that,
of course, you're on the inside track.
Oh,
obviously.
Because after you've worked with them for 10 hours, they already trust you. You're the one who's basically written the requirements document that they're sending out. I think I can't remember a single time that I used that technique in which I didn't eventually get the full project. So it's basically an easy way for the client to start working with you and see if they like the way that you work without a huge commitment. And for you, it's a chance to help them figure out what they need so that you can create an accurate proposal and cost estimate without giving them all of that time. It's just a really nice technique. So something to think about. Okay, so on that, you'll have this sample questionnaire up there, and you go through that process. You start to define the specification. One of the other things that I like to do before I draw up the proposal, if I can, if I can justify the time to do this, even if it's just taking 30 minutes to do this, I want to spend a little bit of time going out and looking at similar websites to the one that we're about to build. Because sometimes, especially if it's an area that I don't know anything about, like restoring giant rolls of paper that have been crushed, or if it's a restaurant that I've never been to and I'm creating a website for them, or if it's a law firm that specializes in a particular type of case, I need to understand a little bit more about the context of that before I can say to the client, I think your website should have this and this and this, and thus I can justify kind of what I'm building into the proposal or kind of anticipate what the scope of the project is going to be. So I used to call this a kind of competitor analysis, but really they're not always competitors, because sometimes you might be looking at websites for organizations that are in a completely different city or state, but it's still useful. So really what you're doing is you're researching websites that are similar to the one you're about to create. And the best way to find those, if you don't know about them already, is to go to a search engine and do a search as if you were looking for the website you're about to build. So what would you search for if the website you're about to create was already in existence? And then you'll get, listings, and probably, a few of the listings that come up there at least will be good comparison sites that you can take a look at. Okay? So let me just give you an example of that. Here, for example, is a pie company. Now they do savory pies and dessert pies, and they're in Michigan, right? So let's say we were working with a pie company that was located in the Dallas area. This is still could be a useful website for me to visit to see what they're doing, to see some of the links they've got, some of the information, like what does their navigation have in it. I want to go and take some notes about what they've got, because then that lets me go back to my prospective client and say, have you thought about this, or have you thought about this? Or I know you said that you think the website should have, such and such, but what I'm seeing some other organizations do is they're doing this, and I think this is cooler. And it just makes you a better informed person. And it's the same thing if you're building a website for your own organization, a company you work for or a company you own. You want to see what other people are doing, because it gives you inspiration. It gives you ideas to make the project you're about to start better. Okay, so let's just take a minute here, and let's use we'll use audio. So if you guys want to unmute yourself, if you've got yourself muted, I want to take just a minute, and I'll take you through a process that I like to use. Have you guys, you may or may not have ever done what's called a SWOT analysis, right? SWOT, which stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Well, I like to use sort of a modified version of that SWOT analysis when I'm doing competitor research or comparable site analyses. And the reason for it is it's actually related to another concept called Six Thinking Hats by a guy in England, I think, Edward de Bono, which is a process for running meetings where the concept is parallel thinking. It's kind of getting your thinking along one sort of route at a time. And in doing a SWOT analysis, the idea is you first focus on, well, what are the strengths? And in this case, we're going to look at what are the strengths of this organization. We're all going to kind of think, or I'm sorry, this website. We're going to think about what do we like about it? What do we think they're doing well? And then we'll come back and we'll talk about some of the things that maybe they're not doing very well that we want to do a little differently. Okay. So who would like to start by throwing out something that they like about this website?
I like the pictures. Maybe it's because I'm hungry, but.
Oh, yeah, no kidding.
All I want
The pictures are great.
Yeah. Yeah, great pictures of food, right? The pictures are of the stuff that they're selling. What else? What else? So you can look at the navigation, some of the different pages they've got. Feel free to visit this on your own computer if you want to. It's gtpie.com.
I think the pictures are the best thing.
Yeah, I really liked the flowered surface of the landing page.
This.
The cutting board.
Oh, yeah, yeah. You know, I hadn't even noticed that that's what it is. You're exactly right. It's like a flowered wooden cutting board. Yeah. What else?
I kind of like the way the icons move in the center of the page as you're selecting them.
Absolutely. Yeah, that you can, gives you little pop-ups and you click on it. You know, and this sort of thing looks like, just as an aside, this sort of little tool looks like something you're like, wow, that's really sophisticated. You know, how do they do that? A lot of these kinds of little things are components that you can find out there where someone has written the code that with just a little bit, you know, maybe an hour or two of customization, you can actually integrate that sort of a component into your site. It may be more than that, but I've found that lately there's some pretty sophisticated little components like that that are actually much easier than I think to build into a website.
Now, John, the pictures scrolling at the bottom right, I mean, are you, because you're moving your cursor across the center, the pictures are moving, or they're just moving at their own pace?
I think they're just moving at their own pace. That's just a timed, like, little photo gallery.
Sequence of pictures.
Yep.
But notice, I mean, sometimes it seems like they go a lot faster and then they just stop.
Yeah, I think they scroll through to the end and then it sort of resets, almost like a cassette tape, where it's rewinding it. Well, here's some, let me throw out some things that I noticed, because a lot of people get focused on the visuals of the site, and that's fine. That should be something that you look at. I also want to, though, think about what about the navigation? Are there things in the navigation of this site that I think are particularly good? Right? Like this, for example. There's a link, you can see it, I'm hovering over it, that says ship a pie, right? Well, is that something that our organization can do, right? If the whole pie was going to be my client, I want to ask them, like, can you ship, or do people have to actually come to your location to pick up their pies? Because that might dramatically change who we target in the target audience for the site. If I know that I can ship pies within, you know, 100-mile radius or something, then that kind of opens things up. I might also see, like, some of the information that's under their About Us page. They've got fundraising opportunities, subscribe to Pie News. A little silly, but you know, they've got a newsletter subscription on the site, which I would note. They have this ship a pie option that I'm going to note as a strength. They have
social media links.
Yeah, they right down here, connect. I can connect with them on Facebook and Twitter. So they have link to Facebook. Maybe that's where they put up all of their seasonal pies. You know, like pumpkin pies are now coming in. I'd want to look at that. They have a pie dough club, which I'm guessing is some sort of a what's it called? Loyalty program, where you can join this online here. You know, maybe that's something that I want to note. Loyalty program. Okay. I also noted that they have a whole list of all of the cafes. So everywhere that you can buy their pies, you know, they've got a link to each of those locations. And then on that page, they're going to have the phone number, an email address for that particular pie shop, as well as hours. Okay.
I think that's a good idea.
Yeah. Address as well. Okay. So these are the kind of things that I would do, and I'd spend a few more minutes than this doing that, looking for things that I like about the site, because that's then going to give me ideas for things that I can go back and either think about building into my own site or suggest to my client. Okay. Now let's take just a minute and do the reverse. So let's do the W of the SWOT. What about this site do you not like? What do you think are some of the site's weaknesses?
I think the text is too small.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, particularly as you get into the site a little bit further. The scope of everything, it's a very small portion of the site. Zoom in a
I
little
think
bit.
there's too much space.
Too much
Like
space.
around, yeah, like on the sides. Like it should be a little bit bigger. They should put more stuff in it. Like there's a lot of empty space on the side.
Yeah, that's true. And I have a really high resolution screen, and that's part of it. But they don't. I tend to agree. They don't use the space very well on the site. They tend to focus you on kind of this one thing, but there's and there's something to be said for white space. But I think they've gone a little bit overboard, because I think that they could, especially when you look at like all of the stuff that they're hiding under this menu up here, they've got a lot of stuff that, how would I know they've got videos about their pie or how they got started, or there may some of this I may not care about, but some of this may be useful stuff that they're missing an opportunity to incorporate more of that into their homepage, for example, by having so much white space.
It would be interesting if they had a tool where it said, "How far are you from one of our pies?"
Yeah.
You put your zip code in, and boom, it zooms you to the closest location.
Yeah, and that stuff is now pretty darn easy to do with the Google Maps.
Right.
Programmatically.
Closest pie finder or something.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's because especially if you look at the cafes, right, there are, I don't know, 15, 3, 6, I mean, there's like 14 or 15 of these, and, maybe I can tell by the name as to which one's closest to me, but you're right, it would be neat if they could say, which cafe should I go to, maybe on our cafes page. See, I'd like to at the very least see a map showing me where it is. So that's a good one.
After dinner you kind of get the sweet tooth, and you're like, well, how far am I away from these things? These look awful good.
Yeah.
You can get over there in 10 or 15 minutes. Let's go. and there's no coupon, John. There's no, hey, for first-time pie purchasers.
Yeah, that's right. So you could say no coupon for.
No call to action for first-time pie customers.
Yep. That's right. What else do you guys see that you don't particularly like about the site? Maybe somebody that hasn't spoken yet today.
On their homepage, normally when I think of a restaurant's website, usually they have galleries if you want to see the pictures. The way it's kind of set up now looks like there's just a bunch of pop-ups. Like, I don't understand why those trees are significant to a pie company. On the bottom, just watch. Yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and then like the big Facebook, these like just both moving parts with the pictures. I feel like I should be clicking X's to get rid of pop-ups.
That's great. Well, yeah, I mean,
I would say, yeah, like clutter, and maybe just like to organize it more better with like a gallery link so you can see our locations, and if you could see our pie, and then it could be a lot more efficient in the way they deliver information instead of throwing all of it at you and all of it moving for you.
Yeah, they are, because, and ever for probably 10, 12 years now, one of the things that you talk about a lot in website design is, people don't particularly like things that are moving on the page while they're trying to read or look around. It's distracting. Yeah. And, yeah, this picture, especially the one down at the bottom, I guess it's supposed to be showing seasonal variations, and I don't know what the white trees are. Maybe those are cherry blossoms.
Yeah.
But that really doesn't have a whole lot to do with me eating pie, and it keeps changing, so I keep having to look down at it, but it distracts me from the other things that I might be trying to do on the page. That's a really good point. What else?
I feel like they're devoting a little bit too much space for fresh from the oven for, a pie company. It's not like you have a ton of breaking news, so like maybe just one or two, and then let somebody click through if they actually care.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Lots of space devoted to news on their homepage. That's right. Yeah, because you got to wonder about, the Petoskey Pie Shop is under new ownership. Who's your, it makes me ask, well, who's the target audience for this? Do I really care that the Petoskey Pie Shop is under new ownership? That seems like that's awesome for the new owner of the pie shop, but for me, that makes me a little nervous. Like, hey, does this person know what they're doing yet? Why did it change owners? Was it that's kind of a weird thing to promote on your homepage. Unless maybe the old owner was just terrible, and now they want to say, hey, it's a better day. That's a good point. What about some of the things that are missing here? You see anything that's not on their homepage that you might expect?
Well, there's no phone number, no contact information that's easily viewable.
Yeah, especially for a provider like this of pies, like I would expect a phone number, maybe an email address, but at least a phone number and an address. And I know that they've got multiple cafes, so they can't give me like, which of these I might be going to, but it would be nice if they could address that. And there's no reason they couldn't have, I mean, if they really have this many different cafes, there's no reason they can't have a central phone number with the receptionist, at least during, regular hours, where I could just call and say, hey, I just have a question. But they kind of make me look for that, and that's something that's a pet peeve of mine. I should never have to look to try to figure out how to send you an email or how to call your company. That's what Google does, right? Ever tried to find a phone number for Google? It's a little bit easier now than it used to be, but they don't make it easy. Facebook does the same thing. Okay. No easy to find phone number.
That would seem like a no-brainer, wouldn't it, John?
Yeah, I mean, especially the fact that if they can ship pies, man, they should be like, call today, here's call right now and you'll have a pie there tomorrow or whatever it is.
Right.
Okay. Well, so that's a good start. So those are our strengths and weaknesses. Now, the next little bit that I do, I sort of combine the opportunities and threats. So O&T, or opportunities and threats. Generally, when I'm thinking about opportunities for our site, I'm going to look at the weaknesses of their site, particularly if they are a competitor. So if this company was in the same geographic region as us, I'm going to look at all the things that I've identified as their site not doing very well, and I'm going to say, these are opportunities for us to make sure we do this really well. So if their phone number is hard to find, I'm going to make sure that our phone number is really easy to find. If they don't have an easy way to find which cafe is closest to you, because imagine if you go up here and it's right after dinner and you're like, boy, we should go out and get a slice of pie, some coffee, something like that, and you get up here and you start looking and you're like, geez, I don't have time to go through all 10 of these. I want that person to then go back to Google, click on my website, and find the nearest cafe in a few seconds and get in their car and head there. So I want to try to capitalize on the weaknesses that I've identified in my competitor sites and try to address those things from kind of the target audience's perspective. And then similarly,
I think you also, John, want testimonials.
Oh yeah, that's a great example of something. They may have them, but they're not obvious, and that's important. I mean, people love to see testimonials, especially with a picture of a happy customer, with their pie, or maybe some crumbs dangling off their lip after eating the pie. So then the strengths of their website become some of the threats to ours. So I want to kind of think about, well, maybe they've got some component, maybe they have this ship a pie thing that we've never figured out how to do, because every time we try to ship pies, they get crushed in the shipping. And so, the fact that they have that and we don't, I want to think about that as a threat. And so I'd maybe write down some of the, or maybe pictures of food, right? So, I mean, obviously these shots of the pies that they've got there, if those were actually done for them, those are high quality images. And maybe my organization, we don't have any of those. And so that's going to be a threat to our website competing with this one if their food pictures look a whole lot better than ours do. So working off of the strengths and weaknesses of their website, I want to start to document some of the opportunities and some of the threats for the website that we're going to be creating. And again, all of this goes back into the documentation and the site specification. Sometimes I will actually list out some of these strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats in the site specification, because I want the client to see this. And in fact, I will sometimes ask the client to go through this same process. If I feel like they would be willing to spend the time, and I've got a good enough relationship and rapport with them, I might say to them, let me find a few websites, and I want you to take a look at a couple of these sites and tell me what you like and what you don't like about it. Like, what bothers you about these sites? Because I want to kind of hear from them about their preferences. And then some of that gets to, in as much as we like to say that we build the website for the target audience, to some extent, we're also building the website for whoever our client is. And if my client says that they hate the color red, even if their target audience is drawn to the color red, I'm probably not going to build them a red website if they tell me they hate it, right? So the more you can learn about your client's preferences and what they like and don't like, the better the project is going to go. I had the worst project experience I ever had was probably around 1999, maybe 2000, right around that time, and I was building a website for a daycare facility. It was, well respected. It was called Tiny Tots, I think, and it was, everything was going great. We got to the design stage, and I spent all of this time, I asked them what kind of color scheme, we kind of talked about that, and I built out the website using this pastel color scheme and did the full mock-up design template, and I think they even approved kind of the initial draft, and we did a second draft, and we're ready to start production, like actually building a working website. We'll talk about this whole process. And the client came back and she said, I've changed my mind. I hate those pastel colors. I want to go with something that's primary, like primary colors, much stronger. And at that point, it was going to take me hours to go back and recolor everything in the site and adjust the whole color scheme throughout the site. And I said to her, but you agreed to these colors early on. And she was like, I hate these colors. And the whole project eventually just blew up. And I think they had paid maybe a third up front, something like that. And I had to just walk away from it. We couldn't get past this communication impasse. And that was my wake-up call about that, regardless of whether I thought that the pastel color scheme that I had chosen looked really good, if my client hated it, it didn't matter. I should not have used that color scheme. I should have learned earlier on. I should have said to them, you go out and find me some websites that you like the color scheme of those sites and show me what you like. And then we'll find something that appeals to your target audience and, makes you happy. Because in the end, you have to kind of do both. So anyway, so that's a big part of why this is so important and why I think it's useful to involve your clients in the process of looking at these other websites, because the more they see, the better informed they are about what else is out there, the better they're going to be able to answer your questions and help you get things right the first time, so you don't have to back up and redo things or get into uncomfortable situations with your client where they've maybe said yes to something because they didn't really understand it, and then later on want to back out of that. by just having them.
How did you, John? How would you have done it differently on the colors? Would you have showed her just a very small portion of what you'd done to get her up front to tell you she didn't like it, or how would you change that approach?
Yeah, well, what we do now is I define the color scheme before we ever start any actual design work. So the mistake I made was the first time she saw the colors was when I presented the draft of the website to her. And so nowadays we talk about what fonts should be used, what colors, what are the kind of the main colors and maybe secondary colors. We talk about the logo. We kind of go through all of that before the design starts. And at that point, I just didn't know it. I mean, I was a few years out of college, and they hired me, and I said, okay, I'll create you a website. Let me go away into my, office for 2 or 3 days and, brainstorm and come up with ideas, and I'm going to design something out, and I'm going to show it to you and hope that you love it. But I didn't learn from the client what they wanted enough. So it's a big learning curve for me early on. Okay, so strengths and weaknesses of a competitor site. Now, the last thing I want to talk about tonight is the process for identifying a target audience. And I want to show you first in our, so here's our online competitor research. Let me jump down to target audience here. The target audience is in the next chapter, but we've got a little time to talk about it a little bit. When we identify a target audience, I want you to think, when you start to think about your target audience, a lot of clients and a lot of people really have trouble defining this well. So, if you look at this list, there are demographic kind of figures or characteristics that we can use to define the audience, and there are psychographic things that we can use to define our audience. We don't have to use all of these. Depending on who your audience is, some of these things may not apply. Like, in many cases, gender is not really a big factor in target audiences. Like, if I have a pie company, I couldn't really tell you whether men or women are more drawn to eating pie. It probably is about, is about equal. But for instance, if I was building a website, for example, for business school, right, for better or worse, I know that tends to skew more male for business school, whereas a lot of other degree programs tend to skew more highly female. And so thinking about gender, and if that's even a factor, and if it's pretty darn close, and if the client can't tell you whether it's one or the other, then just don't include that. Don't make that part of your identifying characteristics. So the first point that I want to make is that you get to pick and choose which characteristics are most useful in defining your target audience. For those that aren't, don't spend time on them. But think about your audience. And I saw at least one of the website processes that someone had identified use the idea of personas. And that's a technique that you'll sometimes see people use to help define target audiences. I don't have an example of it in here, but if you were to do personas, you might say, okay, let's define what a typical customer or visitor to this website, so a typical person that might visit this website, who they might be, right? So you say, okay, who would be a person that likes pie? Maybe they've got a little bit of disposable income, right, because they can go out and have a $5, $6 slice of pie and maybe a $3 coffee and such. So maybe they're in their mid-20s and are working maybe a white-collar environment. Maybe they, live in this kind of area of town. maybe they have this kind of education. So you start to actually define a person. Some people will even give them a name. They're like, okay, this is Jane. Jane works for such and such company as a project manager. Jane has loved pie ever since she was a kid. She lives here. She works over here. And that persona is one way of kind of getting your mind around who you're trying to reach in the website that you're building. Okay. I've used them before sometimes. You don't have to, and I tend often not to because it takes a lot of work to come up with a backstory for Jane. And, people will go so far as to find a picture of, a person that represents Jane and all of that. I tend to keep it a little simpler than that and just, work off of defining these characteristics. So here's an example of, our retail store customer, some pretty broad definitions, but, anybody over the age of 16, lives in Dallas, middle to upper income, typically so they at least have to have a little bit of disposable income, skews maybe slightly female. But some of the psychographic characteristics, I'm looking for people that enjoy desserts and sweets, that likes to spend their disposable income on higher quality products, right? Because you can go to the grocery store and you can buy a pie for $4. But I need to find people that want to come and have a slice of pie that costs $5 because it's that much better. And I'm looking for people that might be frequenters of coffee shops, because if they're going to coffee shops regularly, they're probably going to be the type of person that's going to be visiting our website and that we hope to draw to our shop. So that's how I might define my retail store customer. And then I might create some sub-segments of that and say, here are the people who are the empty nesters who maybe like to go out and do this because they no longer have kids at home. Here are people that are early 20s who go out and have this disposable income because they haven't settled down yet. Define those out. The wholesale customer is another sort of interesting one to think about. So who might you think would be our wholesale customers for this, for pies? Restaurants, right? We could have a whole chain of restaurants around the city that are serving, our pies because they want those high-quality pies that they can charge $5 a slice for. Yeah. Who else might be good wholesale customers?
Grocery stores.
Yeah. So maybe, especially some of the more higher-end grocery stores. That
Whole
sell,
Foods.
That's right. That sell organic products. So again, they can sort of play up the homemade quality of this and could sell, an entire pie for maybe, $15, $20 for a really good pie, right? Might also
tea rooms, like a tea room or a restaurant.
Yeah, absolutely. A tea room or a coffee shop, places like that where people want to go and sit and have, a slice of pie either in the afternoon or maybe in the evening after dinner. And then the next thing I'd start thinking about is say, okay, so those are the organizations that might be wholesale customers. Who are the people though? So what are their job titles and what are they responsible for? The people that would actually be visiting my website who might be wholesale customers, right? Would it be the managers,
buyers, merchandisers, or something?
Yeah, and so I want to think about what motivates them, what's going on in their head, what are their goals, right? If their goal is, okay, I need to have a new type of pie in my restaurant by tomorrow because we just lost, one of our suppliers. I want to make sure that I make it as easy as possible because those people are coming to the website probably as part of their job, and they probably, just like everyone else, have 20 other things that they could be doing. So maybe my goal for those wholesale customers is, one, convince them of the quality of our products, so establish legitimacy, and two, get them on the phone, right? And a typical sort of B2B, business-to-business technique is get them engaged, get them talking to you as quickly as possible so you can build rapport and kind of give them what they need to make a decision. Okay.
Would you ever want to recommend a second website to the customer to target the wholesale accounts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. For instance, a lot of my university clients that we work with will do what's called corporate training, where they might go in and deliver a program on site at a corporation. And we almost always suggest, it can be part of the same website, but at least a separate section, because that's a really different, there's a different goal for those people. There's different information they care about. So we usually create what's called a microsite for those kind of B2B audiences that's different than the main website. So I wouldn't always suggest a completely separate site, because I think it's important that there's some crossover between those, and you want your consumer population to see that you also have this wholesale business. It adds to your legitimacy and vice versa. But you certainly want to separate out the information for those two audiences on the website. Good. So that process. I want to talk just a little bit about the psychographics, because I think that's underestimated. I may have mentioned my undergraduate degree was in psychology, and I did a lot of work around not clinical psychology, but more around research and cognition, learning theory, all that sort of thing. And it gave me an appreciation that I've maintained about how important it is to understand the interests and lifestyles and behaviors of your audience members, and how that plays into creating usable websites. We talked a little bit about usability testing last week and making things clear and simple, and that's something that I think website designers are not always good at, but really getting into the head of your, feels a little creepy, but trying to get into the mind of your target audience and saying, what are they after? What motivates them? What kind of language is gonna kind of draw them in versus what's going to be a turnoff for them is really important. Even in the choice of imagery, like we spend a lot of time, one of the tricks of the trade. And so in the education field, one of the jokes that I always make is that, when you're choosing imagery to use in email marketing or on a website or anything like that, most of the time, you're going to choose an image with a female in it. If there's going to be kind of a one person kind of front and center in that imagery, it's going to be a woman, because women want to kind of feel like, oh, hey, look, there are other kind of women that are going to be in this program. They can kind of associate with that and empathize with kind of that image of being there and either in this new job, if that's what it's leading to, or in the classroom. And guys just want to be in class with an attractive woman. So the joke we always make is you never go wrong putting a successful looking woman in your marketing. Kind of works in both directions, but you got to really kind of think about your audience and understand not only the demographics but also their motivational factors. So that's a little bit about the target audience. I thought I would share with you, though, this is completely unrelated to class, but sort of related to this target audience. That one of the things that I do aside from teaching is I help universities design marketing and design websites and such. And here's an example of a school. I won't tell you who it is. It's not in the Dallas area. This university actually has 5 campuses in different parts of the country. But one of their programs is an MBA in sustainability. And so one of our challenges was, okay, so who is the audience? Like, who's the target audience? If I'm building a website for for people who would be interested in earning an MBA in sustainability, right? So like renewable energy and recycling and all kinds of things like that. So we had to really think about, like, what are the undergraduate degrees that people might have? What's the age range of people that might enroll in an MBA program? What kind of interests do they have, and how can we target them in marketing on various kind of advertising channels? You know, so we identified, like an example would be individuals. In this case, we found out it's 50-50 male-female between the ages of 22 and 45 within 100 miles of this particular campus, who have a bachelor's degree in business, economics, engineering, math, or a related field, and who have an interest in sustainability, recycling, or related topic, and who are interested in earning a master's degree. Like that's a pretty darn specific target audience, and we have 3 of them. That's one of the 3 audiences that we're going to target. But by kind of capturing that, I can almost picture that person, right, between the ages of 22 and 45, within 100 miles of this particular location. They earned their bachelor's degree in one of these topics. They're interested in sustainability. Maybe they're already working in some way in that area. So by going through that process and defining that target audience, now when I sit down and I'm trying to say, okay, well, what do I put on the website that they're going to see when they first come to the site, I can speak to their goals and their needs. I can choose imagery that better reflects their, their demographics, their age group, etc., than I could before I went through the process of defining that audience.
Johnny, you still working on that project?
I am. Mm-hmm. In fact,
I've got an executive that lectures at TCU on sustainability that I'll send you a contact.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I can pass along. I don't know much about their faculty at this institution, but it's certainly I'm trying to wrap my mind around that, and we've actually got 11 different degree programs on various topics that we're trying to figure out how to market, help them market.
And I'll introduce you to an expert in that area.
Great. Well, thank you.
Not a problem.
Okay, guys. Well, that's a good place to for us to start to wrap up for the evening. I'm going to go back here for just a minute and spend the last few minutes reviewing the work, your assignments for this week for the program. So you'll read the second lesson from the course manual. Remember, there's going to be a little bit in that lesson too that we covered last week, just because we had the time to do it. So we talked about pricing and contracts already, but you'll be able to read about those 2 topics in lesson 2 in your course manual. But it will also cover the site specifications, analyzing comparable websites, and the target audience. The last thing we did will actually be in next week's reading, but you can read ahead if you want to. It'll be in lesson 3. So you'll read that lesson. There is an article that I'm going to have you read that describes, I believe it's IBM's competitor analysis process. Yeah. This is a much more thorough process than what I'm going to introduce to you here, but one of the ways in which I'm using these articles is to sort of say to you, the way we're teaching you to do this in class is not the only way that things can be done. We're trying to give you a good standard kind of approach that you'll see used often. But this IBM article, I thought, did a really interesting job of describing a much more, as you might imagine, coming from IBM, a much more thorough and concerted process for analyzing competitors, doing a competitive analysis in a project. The reason that I don't usually use this process is that the time it would take to go through this process is often the time that's allotted to the entire website project for things that I, on the scope of what I typically work on. But it's still good to see how they do it and how, what are some ways very quantitatively to do some competitor analyses if you have the time and the resources to do so. So they spend a lot of time talking about, rating sites on various scales and, doing some calculations of mean, median, mode, all kinds of stuff. It's pretty cool. So you'll have that article to read. You'll also have an article about defining target audiences. And this is, again, from the A List Apart website. So a great article here to read a little bit about how to define those personas and everything, their perspective on that. And then you've got an assignment here to do just a real simple comparable website review, just like we did in class with that Pie Company website. You would choose another site and go through and just identify, 3 or 4 strengths, 3 or 4 weaknesses, identify a few opportunities and threats that you might want to watch out for or take advantage of. That's the assignment. And then the last item here under this week's work is the week 2 comprehension quiz. So that's that just short 3-question quiz just to make sure that you got the key parts of the learning objectives for this week. Okay. Questions? Any questions about any of that? Okay. Well, if not, that's it for week 2. If you guys need anything between now and next Monday, let me know. But you should have everything you need for your assignments is here on the SMU Learn site. I will get this recording of our session this evening posted up to YouTube and send you the link like I did last week. So if you want to go back and listen to any portion of this, I know you were all rapt with attention, but you're welcome to do so if there's anything that you want to revisit. And other than that, just let me know if I can help in any way between now and next week.
Great. Thank you.
Great, John. Thank you.
You're welcome,
Thanks, John.
guys. You're very welcome. Have a good week.
Thanks, John.
You got it.
You too.
You too.